So let's have a look at relationships. So relationships, this has actually been one of the most eagerly awaited releases of Tableau because of relationships. A smart person once said that a great relationship is about two things. First, appreciating the similarities, and secondly, respecting the differences. So this love guru who said this probably is referencing human relationships, but I think that this idea can also relate to data, and we'll have a look at how that can work. With relationships in Tableau, you can now create.
Hello.
Oh, there we go. There's Chris. Chris is actually, and we can hear you now, Chris. So when he's talking later, we'll be able to hear him. Excellent. Relationships in Tableau, you can now create logical relationships between tables. Tableau will only query the data relevant to your analysis, all at the right level of detail. So let's have a look at what this means and how that can actually be useful for you. So firstly, let's think about what has changed. So your options for combining data have just increased. Previously, you could create joins and unions between multiple tables. That essentially what that is, in previous versions, your data model and your data source consisted of a single physical layer where you could specify your joins and unions between your tables. The result was a data source, which in essence is a single flattened table, which you would then use for analysis. In Tableau 2020.2, the data model in your data source includes a new layer, which is above that physical layer, called logical layer. Here, you can add multiple tables. You can relate them to each other on matched field pairs. Tables at the logical layer are not merged in the data source. They actually remain distinct and separate, which is really handy because they then maintain the level of detail until you need them at the specific level of detail in your analysis. So let's think of logical tables as containers for merged physical tables. You can then use joins and unions between your physical tables as you are used to by double clicking on your logical table to open it and work with joins or unions. I'll show you how we can do that. So this is what the new model looks like. So what this essentially is, you can see we've got our logical table, sorry, our physical tables here, which are joined and unioned together, and that creates a logical table, and then that is related to another logical table, and that builds up your data model within your data source. So this is then really, really powerful, and with all the different things you can do. But I'll show you a few examples of what this can mean. You'll also notice a few UI changes. So there's been a few UI changes take place with this release of Tableau. So firstly, on the data connection page, when you're probably used to dragging tables in from your connection pane on the left-hand side, and that would normally create a join or a union, depending on where you're dragging to. That is no longer the case. When you drag your tables in, by default, they will create a relationship in the logical layer. If you want to create joins and unions, simply double click on that logical layer and you're able to join and union your tables together as you were with previous versions. Second, your data pane, when you're building your views and your visualizations, is also different. It's no longer split by dimensions and measures in those specific groups. What you will now find is that dimensions and measures for each logical table will be grouped together. And then any fields or calculations that are referencing multiple logical tables will be grouped together at the bottom in the general area. And this also includes sets. So sets that reference a single logical table will reside within that logical table, but any that reference multiple will be at the general area at the bottom. Your view data is also changed. So when you would right click on a mark and view data in the table format, that used to have two tabs. You used to have summary data and full data. That has changed. So now you still get your summary data, but you then are able to see data from each logical table separately. And I'll give you an example of that a bit later. And then lastly, the extracts window. So when you're creating an extract, you used to be able to store your data in single or multiple tables. With Tableau 2020.2, you now can store your extract in logical tables or physical tables. So just the way that it's working is slightly different. Let's take a look at how relationships work and how we can make the most of this new data model. Okay. So in this demo, I'm going to be using the brand new demo dataset from Tableau. We've all grown used to using Superstore, but today I'm going to use the bookshop data, which is all about a fictitious bookstore. In this actual dataset, there are several tables. If I come in and show you, I'll connect to it. Here we go. We've got several tables, all which are at different levels of granularity, and I want to create some analysis and answer some questions of this data. So firstly, I know if I start building this, firstly, I know that I've got 4 tables, one for each quarter, that relate to my sales. Let's have a look at firstly how we can create a union. So actually the way you create a union is quite similar to how you would in previous versions. So you could drag your first table out, and then I can hold on Control and select my others and drag that out until I drop it onto union like so. So now that has created my new my sales table, my sales Q1 table, and that is a table that is unioned of all 4 my sales by quarters. I want to relate to this my addition table. So I've got my addition table here. I can drag that in, and I'm not joining anymore, so you don't get the Venn diagram. I got this noodle or this relationship. And as with previous versions, if we look at our first similarity to previous versions, Tableau will still create that that relationship based on fields in the physical layer that have the same data type and the same field name. As you can see here, we've got that relationship set up. We can add more fields. But if, let's say, for instance, we didn't have a link created automatically, we can click on our noodle and edit that in this way. But as I said, you'll no longer get that Venn diagram as you used to. If you do want to work with joins, you can do by simply double clicking on one of those logical tables, and then you can bring in the ones that you want. So actually, I can see my union didn't work, so I'm going to bring in my other 3 here and union those in like so. And here we go. We've now got our union of 4 tables. And if I want to come back to my logical layer for my physical layer, I just click close. Lastly, I need to have some data about my book, so I'll drag those in as well and noodle that onto my addition table like so. And Tableau will automatically create that relationship. So I've created my first data set. I'm now ready to answer my first few questions. So if I go to my worksheet, first questions are for me, which book had the highest number of sales? How many transactions took place for each book? And which book generated the highest sales credit? So sales credit essentially is that is the value that salespeople are attributed to in this bookshop, which is actually the total sales value rather than discounted value. So that's just something to note. So question 1, which book had the highest number of sales? So to answer that first question, I drag my quantity purchased out and I drag my title as well. I then sort. So there we go. I've got my top one. I'll just show my mark labels as well. That's my top, my book that had the highest number of sales. As a follow-up question, I know that actually these books have multiple editions. So which edition of that book sold the most copies? So I can now bring in my ISBN edition. And I can now see I've got 4 different editions here. And we can see now I'm actually using fields from 3 different logical tables. So I've got my title coming from my book logical table. I've got my ISBN edition coming from my edition logical table, and I've got my quantity purchase coming from my sales logical table. And these will all be actually aggregated to the right level for my analysis, and the level of detail is set based on dimensions within my view. My second question was how many transactions took place. So another thing you'll notice is no longer do we have our number of records field in our data pane. These have now been replaced by what we call count field. So we've got a count field for each logical table. So in this case, I want to know how many transactions took place. So I can drag my sales count out and we can see how many transactions took place for those books. So we've got number of books sold and number of transactions as well. But yeah, those are, as I said, those count fields replace the automatically generated number of records fields. Lastly, I want to create my sales credit. So I've actually already created this, but we can create this as a calculated field as we did before. Right click in the data pane and create calculated field, or for an edit, right click and select edit. And this is simply my quantity purchased multiplied by the price of my book. As you can see, because I'm referencing fields from multiple logical tables, so we've got quantity purchased from sales and price from edition, this does not reside in one of those logical tables. It resides in the general area at the bottom. I can then drag that out and see where the actual sales credit that generated for my salespeople. I want to order these by my actual edition. So I've got my publication date. So let me drag the year of publication out to sort those, and I can see which year or which edition actually sold the most, which had the highest number of quantity purchased, which one had the most sales generated in terms of sales credit. So that's so far so good. We've created a simple relationship between two logical tables. Let's take this a step further. And let's see if we can look for any data quality issues in my data. So I'm going to, in my second data source, I'm going to create a slightly different data model. So in here, I want to look at my book data this time and relate this to my ratings data. So my ratings data essentially is multiple ratings taken for each book. And then I want to see how these are working with each other. So how many ratings I get for each book, what my average rating was, these sorts of things, and if there's any data quality issues. So first thing I want to do is get my average rating. And I'll change to average. And I want to split this down by each title, like so. And I will sort this for my average rating from my highest to my lowest. We'll also bring our count of ratings out to see how many ratings we actually have received in total. And we'll also bring out our count of books. So this is actually quite important to see, because we've been able to see that our count of ratings is up in the thousands. If we look at our counting ratings, it's hundreds and thousands, so they're quite high. Whereas my count of book column is only showing me one book per row. What this is doing, if we think back to what we would get with a conventional join, is when we create a join based on at this level on book, essentially our number of books, our count of book, would be actually multiplied by the number of ratings. So this would essentially mimic the number of ratings for each book. Whereas now, with the relationship, we retain our table level of detail, and the count of book for each title is correctly showing as 1. So that's really, really powerful. You can get a lot of use cases from here where you've got different levels of detail between your data, but Tableau will retain the level of detail for each table, and you're able to bring that in dynamically. We also notice that we've got some null values. So if you see here, we have a row which has got a title of null with over 500 ratings against it. Let's take a view at our data to take a deeper look at what's going on. If I click on View Data in my tooltip, we'll notice here, as we said before, we've got a Summary tab, which shows us the summary values. But instead of having full data, we now have each logical table's data as a tab separately. So if I click on the Book tab, you see exactly what we'd expect, because there's no book title and no count of book. We have no rows. But if we come to ratings, you can see that the title is null for all of those books that have the book ID CH392. If we'd had an inner join, this data would have been excluded. So this can be really valuable information. So you can get to your data quality issues based on the dimensions you have in your view. So it's really, really powerful to see that. Let's look at this in the other way. So this is where we've got ratings data, but no book data. What about the other way around? If I scroll to the bottom here, we've got book data, but no ratings data. So the inverse of that as well. So you're able to see both at the same time with the relationship. You're not filtering out data unless you want to. So that makes it really, really powerful. But potentially that could be another data quality issue that needs to be investigated. The last example I want to show you is how we can create an actual schema and ask and answer some questions of that data. So I'm going to come into my third data source here. And I know that in this data set, my table that underpins most of this data is the book table. So I'm going to start with that. Let's drag book out. I know that I want to actually add some extra information about this book before I relate this to any of my other tables. So if I double click on this book logical table, I can then join my info table to it. So if I drag that in, then we're working with Tableau as we're used to. I can link based on book ID, and that is then joined to a calculation that is book ID 1 and book ID 2 concatenated together. So I create a join calculation to do that. So I say book ID 1 plus book ID 2, like so, and I hit OK, and my join is then complete. I've got the data that I want, and I've got the relationship set up in a way that I want to. If I then want to then move out from my physical layer, which is where I am now, back to my logical layer, I close that down, and I can continue building out my schema. So there's some extra tables I want to bring into here. So firstly, I have author, and you can see when I drag it in, it noodles it together with author and creates the relationship, as I said. We have award. We have checkouts. We have ratings. And we have edition. And lastly, we have series. The other thing I want to do is add in some other information about my publisher. But publisher links to edition. So I will drag that and noodle that to edition like so. Depending on where you drag, you can see how that is relating together or noodling together. And then I want to bring my sales data in. So I want to add that union again. So I can bring in a new union as you did before, and drag in my 4 sales tables like so. Select OK. So I can now build up my data model in this way. So I'm now combining join data from my book and info tables, union data from my sales tables. Let me rename this as well to sales, and related data from all these other tables. And as I said, they will all retain their level of detail, which is really, really powerful. So let's go and ask some questions. So the first question I have, how many pages has each author written and in which genre? So let's start off with our pages. Pages is easy to search. Pages. And then I want genre and last name of author. So genre and last name of my authors to see how many pages each one is written. Let's sort those. So now we can see how many pages each person has written. You can see in sci-fi fantasy, Thompson has written a lot of pages versus McCrum, who's written a lot less. My next question is, I want to know the promotional budget for each series. So here we can see I've brought multiple tables together, but I want to look at the promotional budget for each of my series of books. So let's have a look at that. So I want to build my view up by looking at the sum of checkouts. So let's bring checkouts out first. And print run size, which is easy to search. Print run size in thousands, and split that down by publishing house, and series name and title. Series name and book title. There we go. So here we can see we've got, I'll sort that again, we've got different books within each series. For instance, we've got the Banana Slug series, which we've got different books in it. I've got here's the different number of checkouts we have of those and how many actually were printed. So the print run size in thousands. You can, if I then bring out my promotional budget to see how much money was spent on each of those books and series. Let's bring out my promotion budget. You'll notice that I have the same value repeating for each one. Let's have a look at what this means. Sometimes using our totals can actually help us understand our data. So let me drag my totals out and I'll add my subtotals in like so. You'll notice that, for instance, for this this series, Banana Slug, there's 4 books with which each have a promotional budget of 2, but the total is also 2. So that is actually matching the value for each actual book, which is a little bit confusing at first. But what effectively is happening is that is telling us that 2 is the correct value for that entire series, but that value is being repeated across each book. So it's not being evenly spread between those books. But that's what essentially I want to be able to do. I want to be able to split my promotional budget evenly between my books within each series. So I can do that with a calculated field. So if I've created this before, so I've got some of my promotional budget and divide that by the window count, so using a table calculation of the count of titles within each series. If I drag this out to my view now, and I want to have this running based on title, I think. Yeah. So now we can see for Banana Slug, take that one as an example. My total is still correct. It is, my promotional budget is 2, but it is now split evenly between each of my books. So you are able to calculate that at the correct level of detail, but the level of detail of my data is preserved. So the level of detail of my promotion data is preserved for the series, whereas I can then get an average or split that promotional budget down across each of my actual books. So that's a really quick breakdown as to the few different use cases for how we can use relationships. Let's have a quick